market selection is much more important. When I was in America thinking about going from Boston to expanding to New York or DC, it was difficult because of demographics, economy, and housing structure. But it wasn't a different language. It wasn't a different culture. A lot of, for example, Singaporean founders who are starting from Singapore kind of have to be very much more thoughtful to be like, okay, I'm not expanding to Indonesia. I'm expanding to Jakarta, the capital city, which is several orders of magnitude higher GDP per capita than the rest of Indonesia. That thoughtfulness would be like, how do I want to expand the geographic markets in a much more thoughtful way? It looks easy on a PowerPoint slide, but actually it's a lot more difficult when you're actually doing it and running it.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave.
Hey, Adriel, good morning.
Morning to you, Jeremy. Good to see you after 2 weeks in California.
Yeah, how was California? I was just in California. It's about 2 months ago, and a lot of it was still as pretty as ever. I was like, wow, it's like the sunshine, the big yachts, the American dream of driving a fast car across a mildly congested highway.
I like to joke with my friends that in California, you get the sun without the sweat, that you get in Singapore.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was definitely great to just hang out in the sun without sweating at all the last 2 weeks, and just to see a lot of old friends from, college and like tech ecosystem. Lots of interesting observations as well. Something that we definitely want to dive deeper in today's episode.
Yeah, happy to chat about it. And I agree with you about the sun and the weather. I mean, that's why there's a lot of path dependency, right? I think everybody goes in California is like, wow, there's so much nature. Everybody loves hiking as a hobby. I went to UC Berkeley for undergrad, and that's where I picked up my love for hiking. If you ask me in army days, do you like hiking? Why would I spend more time in the jungle, right? It's hot, humid. So it's kind of interesting where there's a bit of path dependency where those early cultural experiences where you enjoy hiking in California and then you keep going. Even today, I love walking in Singapore from meeting to meeting. Actually, Singapore's a really walkable city.
On the good days when it's cloudy, not on the sunny days. So, to jump into it, I think one interesting thing I've seen in the last 2 weeks is that a lot of Singapore founders are starting to think about just building directly in California. And I guess there's 2 subsegments to that, right? One is your Singapore founder who has already 2 rounds of capital and is now expanding there, trying to raise US capital to also drive that expansion and to sort of close their first few US customers. I think we also have some portfolio companies like that in portfolio. Second is the Singapore/Southeast Asian diaspora that has studied, worked, or just straight up immigrated over to Bay Area to try and build a company from there. It seems like more and more people are just thinking of jumping straight into SF to build and raise capital. Any thoughts on that?
I think it's a great question. I've been talking to a lot of folks, both people who are going from Southeast Asia or Singapore to America and asking for advice, or vice versa. I actually have a few friends who are traveling back from America or thinking about coming back to Southeast Asia and Singapore. So I think it's not an easy conversation, but definitely a topic of mine. I mean, people used to call them sea turtles, right? Go there, they come back. But maybe they go there again after that, right? So not an easy answer. So I would say that the first thing is to be upfront about it. America continues to be the number 1 tech ecosystem in the world. More specifically, when we say America, we mean San Francisco and New York City as the tech hubs, maybe with Texas as another sub-hub. Those would be the 2 to 3 ecosystems that are really what we're talking about. I think what we see is that Silicon Valley continues to have that power law dynamic where because it has the world financial markets in the New York side, because it has such a deep capital pool, because of the talent and immigration dynamics, there's a little bit of a talent vortex where they're able to draw in people. So this is not necessarily a Southeast Asia problem because it's also an EU problem, an Australia problem. Every ecosystem around the world is kind of like, how do we compare against primarily San Francisco, actually? So I think the fact is that San Francisco's tech ecosystem is very strong. And by nature, everyone else is going to say, how do we compare and should we individually move there or how do we take on some of those opportunities?
You say that SF ecosystem is really strong compared to the rest of the world. How exactly have you seen it across different stages of your life, right? I mean, you're in Berkeley and you build a company after your Harvard MBA, and then now you're very frequently there in your current role at a biotech startup expanding into the US. What is the exact draw and the upside that people expect to have if they're moving to SF?
Yeah, I mean, Silicon Valley is named Silicon Valley because he started out as Silicon Valley, right? Before that, it used to be a fruit plantation kind of agricultural area. But after World War II, there were a lot of veterans that were moving back. There's a lot of good universities, a lot of nuclear research, like in Oppenheimer, the movie. You have this first generation of people who built your first set of giant computers to microcomputers to mini computers, but all of that there. And so there's a very long generational history, I would say 2 to 3 generations deep of technical talent. So obviously from the 1950s, Professor Doriot, he's like a French-American. He later founded INSEAD, but more importantly, he was considered the father of VC. He set up ARC, which was basically a predecessor for almost every VC fund. And so if you think about it, from 1950s, it's like, you can call it your grandparents' generation was there. Then your parents were born around that time period. And then the millennials will be the 3rd generation. And if you're like Gen Z, that's probably the 4th generation, right? So I think Silicon Valley has that depth of 3 to 4 generations of institutional memory around how to deploy capital. And it's got a good mix of cultural factors, like a little bit of a pay it forward, a little bit of utopianism, of like California gold rush days. We want to attract people who are high risk, high reward. And there's a bunch of policies that support that as well, both at the city level. So you look at Cupertino, where there's a lot of Apple employees, etc. There's a strong partnership between that municipal government with the planning and tech component. So I think basically you have that depth of ecosystem, right? So for me, studying at UC Berkeley, I graduated in 2011, and that was right after the financial crisis. Obviously, Occupy Wall Street started out in San Francisco and New York around that time frame. There was this company called Google that was starting to hire salespeople. A lot of my friends went there, and they weren't going to like consulting like I did, management consulting. I didn't go to investment banking. And they've done very well since then. I mean, they've done like 5, 10, 20 years at Google, and they've done very well for themselves because Google has grown and they've been able to use their global profit pool and the ability to hold up profit to feed. And then some of them are now leaving to set up their own startups. And so I think you see that conveyor belt where if you're there at the right time, rising tide lifts all boats, and a rising tech tide lifts all tech career boats up at the same time. So I think there's a strong uplift factor where if you do nothing, you just default to the easiest job that's hiring, is probably going to be tech in San Francisco. So the crux of it is that there's that depth of memory, depth of talent, long, deep, wide network of folks, high density, obviously, San Francisco and Menlo Park. So yeah, I think it's an incredible ecosystem.
So for, a young person thinking about whether to build in Singapore/Southeast Asia versus skipping that initial build and raise in Southeast Asia, go straight to the US, how should they think about that decision? When does it make more sense to just up and out straight, go to the US and build from day one there?
I think it depends on which country you're coming from and what economic situation you're coming from personally. You can't decide whether to go to place B if you don't know where place A is, and then you compare place A versus place B. And I think if you look at Southeast Asia, I think there's 2 very different stories. There's one that's Singapore versus America, and the rest of Southeast Asia versus America, right? So as we previously talked on past podcast episodes, Singapore's GDP per capita is about similar to America, is about $70,000. If you look at GDP per capita between kind of like the rest of Southeast Asia versus Singapore and America, the rest of Southeast Asia is roughly between 7,000 to 15,000. So depending how you look at it, 10 to 5 times lower than Singapore and America, right? So this is the GDP per capita, which is quite important to think about, because one thing that I would say is that for a lot of people from Singapore going to America, it's almost like a seamless transition, right? Because Singapore culture is so westernized. So I could go there and we can sing karaoke, and then we will sing Britney Spears, and then everybody laughs and then sings it together, because I, as a millennial growing up in Singapore, listened to Britney Spears and we laughed about it, and other people sing Britney Spears. So I think it's an easy cultural communication piece that's relatively equivalent. And of course, San Francisco is also quite straightforward. There's also a lot of Asian Americans there. So that also makes that transition easier as well. So I think that's a straightforward dynamic, because similar GDP per capita, high education standards. Singapore does a lot of deep tech as well as focus on engineering. I think it's easy to move to the US. But I think the upside of moving to the US is less. If you're living as an average Singaporean versus an average American, you have a roughly equivalent lifestyle. Now, obviously, it shows up in different ways. In Singapore, they tax cigarettes, alcohol, cars, and freehold land, right? Those things that you will see as part of your American dream, right? Which is, I can drink as much as I want, I can smoke whatever I want, I can have as much freehold land as I want. This is the American dream to some extent. But of course, it shows up in different ways, right? In Singapore, there's a lot of subsidies. Education is free through healthcare. housing as well, and utilities and food. So there's a lot of different ways that it shows up. The lifestyle difference is actually different as well. And so we actually see a lot of folks who are Singaporean from America who want to move to Singapore back because they now have kids. And then when you have kids, things like health insurance, childcare, being able to have helpers to support, those are all dimensions that are quite important for a family. Safety and security is another big thing that comes up.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say here is that the lifestyle difference isn't so large, right? And obviously people can have their preferences. Like I prefer to live in that kind of lifestyle, American lifestyle, versus another thing, which is in Singapore. From the other angle, of course, is if you're coming from a country with a significant lower GDP per capita than America, then obviously you start thinking to yourself, how do I move to America? How do I move to Switzerland? How do I move to Singapore? Because there's a better set of economic environments. This is a simple fact, right? And when we think about it, if you travel from somewhere that had around 7,000 to 8,000 GDP per capita, you travel to about America level or Singapore level GDP per capita on a purchasing power parity level. And let's say your economy is growing about 5% and America and Singapore is growing about 2%. Then it's going to take you about 50 years for your country to catch up with America, Singapore. So in other words, if you take a 12-hour flight or 20-hour flight, you are traveling 50 years in the future. So you can have a better life for you and your family. Of course, you're going to have more money per hour. You're going to have more networks. Your child can live a better life. And I'm very sympathetic to that because if I think about my great-grandparents, my grandparents, they left China because there was political disunity and fragmentation and war. Yeah. So they said, anywhere is better than here right now. And so let's make the move, right? And that's why I'm here in Singapore, right? I wouldn't be here if my great-grandparents, my ancestry said, like, let's move. And I mean, if you probably go back more generations, humans were very mobile, right? I'm sure the way they looked at it probably was like, how do I move from northern China to southern China to western China? Everybody was moving. So I think human mobility is a very normal piece to have.
And I like that framing of moving to America and hopping on that 17 to 21-hour flight as like a time machine almost from multiple fronts, especially when you think about it at a GDP per capita level and what that means for a founder building a business. Our wallet hurts a lot after all the Uber rides in California. It's like easily $20-$30 on average for a trip, whereas in emerging parts of Southeast Asia, it never gets more than like $3 or $5, right? So that's like a almost 10x multiple difference, so which literally means per time unit effort, you get 10x more revenue or 10x more profit. And software companies can consequently be like 10x larger in America than say Indonesia, much more similar like time fashion. I guess the other thing to think about and like the other like segment is the non-founders. I guess the people who are like, potentially looking to move to America and join as executives, which maybe is an even larger pool than the people who are founders and thinking about moving there. And I'm guessing you probably know quite a bit of them. How have you seen them navigate that sort of career decision?
Yeah, I think where it kind of boils down to is what is the Southeast Asia tech ecosystem good for? And I think that you can build billion-dollar outcomes. You gotta be thoughtful about how they happen. Watching YouTube about American-style startups for American-style market. So we've talked about it. For example, America is like 50 states. So it's very straightforward for them for an idea to ripple out across the unified regulatory market. In Southeast Asia, everyone's an island, right? And then even if we're not islands, we also, split by country. So being thoughtful about, are you going to be like a single country, a dual country conglomerate versus digitally versus being a regional player? There's a lot of different dynamics to that. I would probably like peel the onion by talking about several slices of it. So for example, I would say on average, if you are a founder who's very into deep tech, like quantum or very, very deep tech, probably America has a deeper capital pool and deeper talent pool because of the university, the PhD side. Again, I'm not saying that you can't build it in Southeast Asia, but if you're building in Southeast Asia, you'll probably be building a deep tech company in Singapore. And then if you're looking at globally, you're probably building this in San Francisco. And I would probably make the argument that a lot of the people doing deep tech, they're not doing this in tech, New York even, or London as well. There's a little bit of that. Again, Vortex pulling to San Francisco that has the deepest capital pools for these moonshot, cascading miracles type of startups. I would also say that for folks who are, coming from a low GDP per capita country, it's almost a no-brainer, I would say, to travel to a high GDP per capita country. I mean, first of all, like I said, you get to earn more money where the cost of labor is higher, you get educational outcomes, participate in the upside there. And then your personal lifestyle also probably gets better as well. You're not dealing with pollution or congestion or, kind of like a low standard of living. So I think there's a dramatic shift. And I've seen a lot of friends who came from low GDP per capita countries who are now in America, and they have a fantastic life because from their perspective, it's like, wow, I'm part of my community. I moved to my equivalent of Chinatown in terms of the suburb. We have a yard. We don't have war or civil war or something like that. It's a very interesting dynamic where I look at them and I'll be like, yeah, you fulfilled the American dream, right? You got to move to a better place and have that dream. So I think it's pretty no-brainer in that sense. I think there are several groups of people, like I said, coming back. And first I mentioned people who want to set up a family, primarily Singaporeans or Singaporean linked, because again, the GDP per capita is equivalent to America. And on a purchasing power parity is actually higher than America. Most of it shows up in family-friendly dynamics for middle class folks. So that's one cluster I see coming back. I think the second cluster, it goes back to the time machine, is people from America and China who are traveling to Southeast Asia because they feel like they're traveling back in time. So there's a famous type of anime called Isekai, which is basically saying a protagonist from normal day life travels back in time or travels to a fantasy world. And then using their knowledge of the modern world, they become better and superior. Like, I don't know, if you travel back 100 years ago, you'd be like, wow, did you know about penicillin and antibiotics? And then you become a wizard because you can cure people like magic. You know how CPR works, so you're able to bring dead people back to life. The guy passed out, had a heart attack, and you're like, trust me, it's a magic spell. And so I think a lot of folks travel back in time. So you saw that with Grab and Gojek. These were Harvard Business School MBAs who traveled back in time. They saw Uber. They traveled back to Singapore, Indonesia accordingly, and they built billion-dollar companies because they saw the future. And they said, I will build the future into the present of Southeast Asia. So I think that's one cluster. And obviously we saw Forrest Lee. He's a C Group, Stanford MBA. And then he moved to Singapore. I set up C Group because he was also saying like, hey, I understand the Chinese ecosystem in terms of e-commerce and the platform. I see America. I can see it happening. So he built the future. And now we have Shopee and all these various dynamics with the C Group. That's another cluster. Third cluster I see is obviously people who are like civic-minded. Living in a country is not just living in a country, you're actually participating. So do you agree with their politics, their economics, their government structure? And some people basically say like, you know what? I grew up in Singapore. I'm Singaporean. And I don't want to spend my entire life in America and become American. I want to contribute to Singapore society. So that's actually a big, I would say, chunk for a lot of people. Like, where is home from a emotional and almost spiritual level in terms of like your civic mindedness and community level. I think lastly, let's be real, like a lot of Singaporeans don't leave Singapore and a lot of Indonesians don't leave Indonesia and they are still successful, right? So you would say that you look at a lot of Singaporeans, obviously we see the Zopim folks for SaaS, they built it out in Singapore, they were successful outcome. Obviously we see a lot of VCs that grew up here. You see Mohan Belani at E493. He's just built his entire career in Singapore. And, the way they play to their strengths is basically saying like, in Singapore, you're like, hey, I'm playing the long-term game. I have all of the social networks. I'm accumulating that over time. For example, when I moved back from America to Singapore, a lot of my social networks didn't move back with me. I think my skill set, my knowledge, my experience moved back with me, but not my social networks. I think there's one thing that doesn't port easily. And so something that doesn't port easily is something that's a competitive advantage, right? In the sense that if you're in Southeast Asia and you're still here, one of the ways that you can outcompete somebody who travels to America and back is really through networks, right? You're building out 10, 20, 30 years of working relationship, trust, affiliation, identity. And that's worked well for many types of companies as well as jobs, right? VCs is helpful. In fact, I'll probably make an argument that if you're wholly educated in America VC for 20 years and you move to Southeast Asia, you're probably not well trained for the Southeast Asia ecosystem, right? If you want to be VC, you still want to spend time in America to some extent. You still want to learn. You still want to get trained there. You still want to read YouTube and learn the future. But to some extent, if your core asset is a network, then you just can't build it remotely. That's why all your online schools and communities kind of died out because humans are still physical monkeys in meat space. So I think companies that require more networks is one side. Also, there's still a lot of like private knowledge. Also depends on like what kind of background and advantages you already have in your home country. If you come from the top 1% in Southeast Asia because you're affiliated with a family or something, then that strength doesn't port with you to America. So you're just going to be starting from the ground level in America. But in Indonesia or Thailand or wherever, you are part of that. So why not play to the advantage depending on how you look at it? I think it really depends. It's kind of intersectional. Right? One part is geography. The other part is your prior economic status. The third is actually your prior affiliation or network status. And then fourthly is your life stage. And lastly, maybe the fifth is your interest or skill set. So those are the different dimensions.
Yeah. I think maybe just to double click on the sea turtles that go out and have done well and are now thinking to come back because of all sorts of reasons. I think you navigated that decision coming back before, right? And, a lot of the successful examples they brought up, Forrest Lee and the Zopim guys, Mohan, they all became founders. What does the non-founder life look like, moving back from from the US to Southeast Asia? Like, are there opportunities for people? Are there good enough companies to do it? Like, what can they do? And I think there's probably a bunch of folks in the Bay Area who are now also thinking about that, right? After spending a couple of years there.
Yeah, I think for folks moving back from Silicon Valley and to some extent New York to Singapore, I think there are three warnings or heads up I will give them, right? The first of all is that Singapore works more. The average Singaporean works 50% more working hours than the average American, right? And then I'm not even talking about tech American, like your Google campus and, so you just work more. And I mean, that's why Singapore has a higher GDP per capita on PPP, purchasing power parity. Obviously, it's three sectors, right? One is Singapore has lower productivity per hour than America, but Singaporeans work 50% more. And of course, Singapore subsidizes it with cost of labor pools to help subsidize the cost of construction and domestic help and so on and so forth. So those are the three sections that support Singapore's headline number, which is, wow, Singapore is GDP per capita, unadjusted for purchasing power parity is the same as America. Adjusting for purchasing power parity is even higher than America. But I think what's hidden is that Singaporeans work harder on average than the average American. So one is you got to work harder moving back to Singapore. Some people are like, okay, forget about it. So you work harder. Some people are like workaholics, like me, and I'll be like, oh, great, no problem. So I think that's a really fundamental fact is that I think the average Singaporean works 50% more than average American. Now, obviously, maybe you an above average American versus a below average working Singaporean, but I'm just saying that's a fact. I think the second part is like, obviously, your end markets are very different. So when you're working in tech, in America, you're building deep tech, servicing B2B SaaS, for example, because American cost of labor is high. So the Uber is more expensive. Well, because America's cost of labor is higher than in Singapore, and Singapore's cost of labor is a lot higher than that in, say, Indonesia, Vietnam, right? So if you look at the cost of a ride here, it's equivalent to the Big Mac index, which is the cost of a Big Mac in America versus Singapore versus kind of like Philippines or Thailand or Malaysia. So I think you need to be aware that it's hard to automate B2B function in SaaS if the cost of labor to do it is very cheap. I think America and to some extent Europe has more B2B SaaS adoption because cost of labor is expensive. So I'm like, wow, if I buy this subscription, it straight away replaces the cost of like half a full-time person that is $50,000 per year. My SaaS is only cost me $5,000 per year. Wow, it's like a 10x ROI, right? Versus if you say, wow, I pay $5,000 but replaces half a person, but my cost of labor is 7,000 GDP per capita, then wow, I'm actually paying more for SaaS than for using a human to do it, right? And the human is more nimble, can do more different things, right? So I think that's one cluster is like your end market is different because now you're building for more fundamental stuff. That's where the time travel machine, going back in time things like, Southeast Asia doesn't have a lot of stuff. It doesn't yet have a strong B2B SaaS place. And it's a matter of when, not if it happens, because Indonesia is growing 5% year on year. Prabowo has promised, 7 to 8%. So the whole point I'm trying to say is that America and Singapore is growing about 2% year on year GDP per capita. So we said it'll take about 50 years to catch up, but there is that threshold in about maybe 10 to 15 years where it really makes a lot more sense. Are you willing to be patient and build that B2B SaaS in Southeast Asia, but take a long time to get there is one side of it. Or you can build something that's a little bit closer. So you see a lot in Southeast Asia. There's a lot of growth in e-commerce, consumption, cross-border commerce, entertainment. So these are more like, I would say, China style to some extent, because China's GDP per capita is actually only about 15,000 per capita, which is about equivalent to Malaysia and Thailand, around there. So to some extent, the future of Indonesia is a Malaysia-style GDP per capita, Thailand-style GDP per capita. So I think to some extent, some of the models that are there, and so you see a lot of founders actually in Southeast Asia, a lot of them have experience through Alibaba, the founders program there. A lot of them have spent time in China. So they also went to a time machine, but the time machine only went forward 10 to 15 years and then came back. And now they're like building a more grounded startup that is not deep tech, not super AI agents, but could be a little something simpler like call center automation. In America, there are no call centers left because it's so expensive. But in the Philippines, there's a huge BPO, huge call center business. And so, yeah, if you can automate that by 10%, 20%, 30%, that's a PE business. You can automate that by 50 to 80%, which is, I think, what we're approaching. That's a VC type of business. So I think being thoughtful about that business is the category number 2. And I think number 3, I think what you just have to be aware of is, I think that market selection is much more important. So I think for me, when I was in America, thinking about going from Boston to expanding to New York or DC, it was difficult because of demographics, economy, and housing structure. But it wasn't a different language. It wasn't a different culture. It wasn't a different political structure. It wasn't a different regulator. It wasn't different regulations. So I think a lot of Singaporean founders who are starting from Singapore have to be very much more thoughtful to be like, okay, I'm not expanding to Indonesia, I'm expanding to Jakarta, the capital city, which is also several orders of magnitude higher GDP per capita than the rest of Indonesia. I'm expanding to KL, not the whole of Malaysia. So I think that thoughtfulness would be like, how do I want to expand the geographic markets in a much more thoughtful way? And I think that's something that it looks easy on a PowerPoint slide, but actually it's a lot more difficult when you're actually doing it and running it.
Interesting. It goes back to your point again about the US, 50 states, single regulatory market, Southeast Asia, pick off all the capital cities, but each capital city belongs to a fundamentally very different political, regulatory, economic regime. So I guess the complexity for multi-city expansion is also much higher than in the US. Yeah, consequently, probably takes you a lot more time for that sort of new market expansion growth that people want to see, especially if you're building a VC type business. I think that's all my questions for now. Thanks so much, Jeremy, for talking through some of your reflections about what you see across the US and Southeast Asia from an immigration, diaspora flow perspective. Definitely a lot of things have changed since the COVID era where America didn't do such a great response and everyone flocked back to Southeast Asia. I think we're now starting to see that outflow come out again. Any parting thoughts about the whole Southeast Asia diaspora, both the inflow and the outflow?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of stuff I've talked about has all been generalities, right? So it's about the average country GDP per capita, the average man hours worked per citizen of that country. So these are all averages, but I think first of all, everybody has an individual story, right? So they have an individual set of decisions like, am I having a family? Do I have to take care of my aging parents back home? What are my skill sets? What's my alumni network? So there's a bunch of individual dynamics that's really boils down to the individual person. And then of course, the future may also change, right? Maybe America's GDP per capita grows from 2% to 10% because of AI. Maybe a country in Southeast Asia's GDP per capita growth drops from 5% to 1%. So I think the future can change. And then the last thing is that I think for most people who are in the tech world, you're drawn to it because you have high risk appetite and higher reward appetite. You're not the average person. You're exceptional in some dimensions, not necessarily in skills, but also maybe in your preferences. So a way I would think about it is just like it's a two-way door, right? Like traveling to a country and traveling back is not really a problem. It's a 20-hour flight there and it's a 20-hour flight back. So, like what's the cost to you to try 1 month, 3 months, 1 year there is actually relatively low compared to like my great-grandparents' time who took a boat for months and then they never moved back because it was just impossible. And then they'll write letters once every 5 years. Yeah, I mean, like now you can FaceTime your loved ones back home. It's just the world is so flat and it's getting flatter and more connected over time. So what I'm trying to say here, to some extent, you have to try it, which is maybe you have to travel there and try it and see whether you like it and see whether it makes sense for you. And then vice versa is like, yeah, if you're there, you want to move back, you have to try it out and then see for yourself whether it's time for you to move back. And we're all going to live 100 years on average. I think, one question that I often talk about with other folks is like, how much is enough, right? Like, how successful do you have to be in your career and what is that right cadence or tempo? And some people obviously is like, I want to go as aggressive as possible for that maximal top 0.01% outcome as much as possible, unicorn outcome. And so other people, like you said, are executives and they're like, okay, I hit a certain level. This is my best set of working hours, my personal life, my hobbies. So I think dynamic is key because then you make a set of decisions to yourself like, okay, now I have one life. How do I want to use it? And if you're not happy in a country, if you have the privilege to move, then you get to move. And so I think that's how I would think about it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jeremy. It was great catching up after 2 weeks in California.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.